Hello, hello. Welcome to Facebook Live. Wes, joining
Hey,
me
Britt.
again.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do this thing. Welcome to Facebook Live. We are going live today from the SDI Facebook page and the ERDI Facebook page, as well as YouTube. So if you are not tuning in from one of those places, we're not going to be able to see your comments, unfortunately. So if you want us to see your comments, join us over on the SDI page, ERDI page on Facebook, or YouTube. Now with that, we have that little bit of housekeeping out of the way. If you're joining us, please tell us where you're from in the comments, and so we can say hey to you. But while we let people say hey, Wes, what have you been up to since we last spoke on, what was it, the SDI pop quiz?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So what, a week and a half ago?
I guess so. I lose track of time so fast.
Yeah. So with that, geez, I've been working and how about a little bit more working,
Yeah.
and the kids go back to school. Actually, today was their first day up here in South Carolina, or at least my part of it. So
Nice.
it's been quiet.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? My kids went
It
back to
is.
school last week, and I don't know what came over me. Like Tuesday or Wednesday, I was working from home and I looked around my house and I was like, I'm the only one here. Why am I still trying to be quiet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Put on
You
some
guys sound
music
like
or something.
ingrained in like, I have to be quiet. The kids are here too, but so funny. Um, so today we're here to talk about standard versus mandate. But before we get to that, I'm going to introduce myself and then I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Wes.
All
I
right.
am Brittany Bozick, your friendly content manager here at International Training. If you ever have an idea for any type of content that you would like International Training to create, I would love for you to send me an email at marketing@tdisdi.com. I'm the girl responsible for all the social posts, blogs, newsletters, all that great stuff. So I can help make that happen. Today I'm joined by Wes Kilgore. He's on this side. He is one of our newest staff members here at International Training. And we are so excited to have his wealth of knowledge in the ERDI space here at headquarters. But I'm going to let him introduce himself. Wes, take it away.
All right. Hey guys. And let me get in real quick. Hi, Guillermo. I see you commented already.
Hi,
Um,
Guillermo.
so my name's Wes. I am one of the newest people over here well, actually now I am the newest person at International Training. I come out of law enforcement. I did that for 15 years. Before that, I was in the Army. So total been diving for about 27 years, but I've been doing the public safety diving side for the last little over a decade. I have gotten to play in both sides, operations and leadership within that realm of public safety. And so we'll get to kind of talk about that a little bit today on what it means for the standards versus mandate, because perfectly honest, operations is my love. I would much rather be on the water, throw a suit on me, put a mask on me, don't let me breathe normal atmospheric air, just throw me down under the water, breathing something pressurized, and it'll be great. But that's not always reality. And unfortunately, at some point, you got to move up in life and take over a little bit of leadership too. So we will be looking at it kind of from that viewpoint and from the operational side and showing you how they should mesh. They should never be something that should butt heads. And we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah. So since we're streaming on the SDI page, and I'm just this is not in our outline lesson, I'm so sorry.
No, no
But
problem.
since we're on the SDI page, maybe we should give everyone like a little overview of like public safety diving and what those type of divers get into before we jump into like the nitty gritty of standard versus mandate.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so what I want you to do for anybody that's not a public safety diver already, I want you to take and I want you to imagine just this pristine, beautiful environment, this water that's just crystal clear, may have a wreck in it, has some gorgeous fish that you're just absolutely loving. And just imagine the exact opposite right now. So that is the public safety world you'll be in. Um, we used to even say, let's just close our eyes because we can't see anything anyhow. You're
Yeah.
diving in mud, sewage sometimes. I mean, you name it. If it is something that is a liquid that you can get into that's not going to necessarily eat your suit right away, it will eventually, but not necessarily right away, then yeah, we probably have put a diver in it at some point in time. For some reason, no matter what, if there's a body of water anywhere located within an area that you can hike to, you can drive by, especially you can drive by,
Yes.
or that any person can get to, at some point somebody's going to do something to either dispose of evidence in it, drive into it somehow or another. I don't care if it's on the side of a cliff, they'll find a way to drive into it. And just all around bad things. So at some point, we're going to have to put some sort of public safety into it, whether it's because there's life and limb still in peril, i.e. recent drowning, something like that. A recovery that needs to be done, either because of a crime scene, which most of them are eventually going to be a crime scene, or at least treated as such, or any number of things. Sometimes just as simple as there are pipelines that travel underneath the waterways out here, and we may have to put hazardous material technicians down in there in order to do something to abate a problem. Hey, Rusty. Good to see you, buddy. So, Rusty
Cool.
is one of my former students who was also one of our public safety divers in the region I'm in.
Oh, awesome. Well, I think that was a really great explanation of public safety diving and a good overview to give us the foundation that we might need to talk about our topic today. As I said, we're talking about standard versus mandate. So if you have questions about that or public safety diving in general, please feel free to drop them in the comments, whether they're over here or down there, wherever they are for you. We would love to answer your questions. So let's go ahead and get into this. What do we mean by mandate?
All right, so with mandate, we are more looking at try and steer your mind in the direction of your standard operating procedures or your standard operating guidelines, whatever you want to call them. Some different regions call them different things. The reason why sometimes is just legal terminology. You don't want to necessarily call them protocols or anything like that, because you have to steer away from them for any number of reasons, because we cannot write every scenario into our operating guidelines. Then we need to be able to call them just that. It's a guideline to work off of. That way it allows us a little bit more room. So that's what we're looking at when we start looking at mandates.
So is a mandate, is a mandate a requirement, or it's just a guideline somewhere in the middle maybe?
By its own terminology would be a requirement, but what we're looking at is not so much the vernacular sense of, how the definition is. What we're looking at is more, this is the job that you have been given, and these are the guidelines that you are operating within in order to accomplish that job. So that's what we're going to be addressing today, is how the standards and those SOGs actually fit together.
Cool. And SOGs, for the people in the back who maybe don't know, what is that?
That's the standard operating guideline.
Cool.
So that's what we're going to refer to as SOGs. That's just a mouthful, so I'm not going to say it 100 times today.
Totally. All right, cool. So standards and SOPs should be based in best practices?
Yes. Okay. So when we look at these things, why do we actually have standards? Why do we have standard operating guidelines? So when we're looking at it, let's look at it from two different ways. Let's look at it from the training agency point, which is us as ERDI. We have standards in order to, one, make things a little bit more uniform for everybody, since interoperability is what we're looking at for teams to be able to work together and to basically have a standardized format that they're working from. This is what pushes our standards of training and so forth, because here's the thing. If I've got a team down, let's say in Tampa, Florida, all right, water around Tampa is not ugly necessarily. I mean, you go a little bit inland you can get into some pretty tannic water, some black water environment, but you go out onto the coast, well, granted, for every mile you go out, you can almost, step another foot deeper, but it's pretty pristine looking water. You can see around a good amount. The water is somewhat stable as far as currents go, at least predictable. So really, we're looking at a very different type of training than, let's say, somebody up in Michigan in the Great Lakes who are going to be in sometimes some pretty rough water, especially during the wintertime, some ice diving, pretty dark water, very deep water. So we can't necessarily train the exact same way. So how do we write our standards so that it meets the best for both of them? And that's what we're looking at. And so we're looking at best practices. These are defensible methods of actually doing things. And they're based on several factors. They're based on actual scientific research. Most of our research is based out of either Divers Alert Network, U.S. Navy, or even Royal Navy studies, South African Navy studies, basically all the groups that put into our current knowledge base that we use. We are not trying to necessarily dictate what we do because of 100% what our insurance says. Granted, we have to be insurable in our programs. But what I mean by that is it's not so much because our insurance turned around and told us, well, you can't do that because all we'll say is, 100 feet. Well, that's obviously not the case. We present our programs to our insurance companies for that, so that they can look at it and say yay or nay. But we base what we do off of a lot having to do with these studies that are being done scientifically. And for anybody that's been out there and gone beyond their open water, beyond their ERD1, it's really started studying, decompression and so forth, that those studies have been going on for a while. So it's not just, the last 20 years, 30 years. I mean, we've got some of our first decompression models that we currently use today, even back in the 1800s.
Cool. So you said you touched on a little bit best practices being defensible in court.
Right.
So how do we make sure of that?
So basically, and to continue forward with that, these have to be defensible for the court purposes, because when we show up or when we wind up having to do something, whether it's from the training aspect side, it's going to come down to litigation in court. Can we defend what we did for the purposes we did it? And the way we have to look at it is we have to review these things based off of our current knowledge, based off of accident analysis, and based off of analysis just in general of either what we would say is epidemiology. Basically, there's not necessarily a research study, but based off of everything we've been seeing out here, this happens or that happens. So these are the best practices guidelines we're looking at. Same way that we have to build our standard operating guidelines when we start looking at teams. There's always a lawyer involved somewhere. So, and I like to say that I've got a few friends that are lawyers. Even being a cop, I still have friends that are attorneys. Somehow or another, I don't know how that happened, but they also know I'll make fun of them in a heartbeat, and they do the same to me. But with that being the case, at some point, if I have to stand in front of somebody and say, I did this because, do I have a reason behind it? And with that, that's when we start looking at best practices. Is it what the current... Okay, and Mark, I'll answer your question here in just a second. I just saw it too. Is it the current that most people are going off of? Is this outdated because this is a standard that we did back in the 80s that we're not doing anymore? Things of that nature, things that we have to stand up in front of courts for. Now, when we look at departments, I know with both departments I was with, we used to keep a what we call a critical incident file. These weren't just our critical incidents. These could be from anywhere in the country, but they gave us a footing later on as to why we made this decision. We were presented with this particular situation, and that's another team encountered that kind of situation in the past. with that, this ends up occurring. An analysis of what occurred caused us to make this decision. And that's why we kept a critical incident file, which helped us kind of determine what the best practice might be if it's not already covered.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of making this clear as mud right now, and it'll get a little bit better as we progress. That's why some of the stuff is in the outline. But basically what I'm saying is best practices are going to be defensible in court, and that's the biggest thing you have to remember on it. Mark,
But by having that critical incident file, it makes your best practices more defensible because you're saying, we have a history of this, we've done this before, so that's why we acted in this way.
Right. And then, and granted, I'll touch base somewhere down in here. I've got it in there. But you'll also have expert witnesses. Everybody hires an expert witness for any reason. Does anybody, well, I can't really ask the question on here, but if anybody's familiar with going to court, an expert witness basically is somebody that is more familiar than the layperson with this particular topic. That's really what a definition is, depending on the courts that you're in. So some states or some jurisdictions and venues may define it a little bit more than that, but essentially when it comes down to it, that's what it is. So any person that basically is more familiar than the common layperson may be called upon at some point to go into court and essentially testify to which side's telling you to testify to. You can find expert opinions that will counter each other all day long in courtrooms. So do they have weight? Yes, but that's really part of the defensibility practice as well, is what the experts are saying, what the current science is saying, and what just the encounter in the environments you're going into has been in the past. So Mark, let me get to that real quick on your question. In your description, mandates are written by a department team who is writing standards. So with that, what we do is we do a review process on standards to take a look and see that our standards are still what's working best out there currently, and they still match, once again, continue to use the term best practices.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna make this a little bigger again. All right, so moving on. Our role as a training agency is to set up a program that encompasses a generalized and standardized approach to public safety diving. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, and we kind of touched on it already.
Yeah, we did.
So with that, as I pointed out, a team in the tropics is not going to operate the same way that a team in Michigan will. Or let's go out west and let's go to Lake Tahoe, where they've got depths of 1,600 feet deep, and they're doing altitude dives on everything. Those teams are going to operate differently too. So you will look at our ERD1 guidelines or our ERD1 standards, and you will see that they are fairly broad. You will see that they cover basically the knowledge and information that you should have as an entry-level public safety diver, and dynamics of drowning, evidence recovery, basic testifying in court, evidence handling, that kind of stuff. You don't see things like black water being mentioned in there. Now, the way this is covered is that you'll also see another line in there that basically talks about the fact that your certification is based on your experience and your training. So essentially, if you did black water training during your certification, then yeah, you're covered. But it's all about what kind of training you're doing as part of your ERD1, and we allow you to incorporate that. Mind you, if you're an instructor, I would recommend not throwing them into black water and doing skills evaluations, because then you can't see them. But obviously, blacking out your masks, so forth, that helps cover that, and then exposing them to it. Stress inoculation, it's a huge thing in training. Is it specifically mentioned in the standards? No, it's not. So we give the instructors a lot of leeway as long as they stay within defensible practices. Don't just go out there and start trying to drown proof a brand new diver by ripping regs out, things like that.
Yeah.
That's not what we include in the standards, and that's not what we mean by giving you broad leeway. What we're trying to do is we're trying to let you customize it to your region, to the specific environments you're going to be putting your divers into.
Cool. So everyone should take ERDI 1 and ERDI 2 as their core courses.
Right.
But then after that, it's your team's job to develop your own SOPs specific to your team and your discipline of public safety diving.
Right, and that's why we have a lot of our ops components set up the way we do. You don't see the ops components necessarily included in a lot of our training, specifically because the good example I've already mentioned, Tampa teams don't need ice diving more than likely. South Florida teams don't need ice diving. Galveston, Texas teams don't need ice diving. You go up north, though, New York State, they need ice diving. So that's why it's an ops component and not part of your core education, is because it allows you to customize the training as you need it. Also because there are specific mission requirements that you may not do. Let's say hull search techniques. Not every team is going to necessarily do that. If you are a team in a landlocked region that is going out and mostly doing potential recoveries.
I'm with you, Lewis.
Lewis, yeah, I hear you, buddy. So if you're going out and doing potential recoveries of vehicles and guns, stuff like that, out of the water, or here and there a few drowning incidences, but you don't have anything that's necessarily a target for ASOL, but necessarily a target for terrorist activities or anything like that. Hull search techniques may not be high up on your agenda of things that your team needs to train on. So you'll see a lot of different things in there as to why we customize. Helicopter, you have helicopter emergency evacuation techniques that we train for. Well, if your team doesn't have a helicopter, do you really need to be doing that training? So
common sense, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to set up here is a common sense approach to this, so that we give you the cores that you need to cover, and the rest of it you can model according to what your team needs.
Yeah, that's really what's so great about ERDI is we are very customizable while giving you the training that you need. So do you want to go through the different things people would need to include in their SOPs?
Yeah, and it's really hard to cover a lot of these all in one place. I mean, you have some teams that, and there's different, let me add this too. There are different viewpoints that you'll get out of different legal minds as well. You may have a county attorney that thinks the more we really hone in on something, the more liability we're incurring if we don't do it exactly that way each and every time. So they may want to leave their SOGs just a few pages long and leave it at that. And then you may have the opposite legal viewpoint that says, oh, no, we need to have as defined of an outline as possible. Yeah. And therefore you have other teams that have a 300-page manual. So am I going to sit here and tell you which one's better? Nah, I won't. Which one's easier to write? I can tell you that all day long. I've had to sit there and do that and review them. But with that being the case, when writing them, the biggest thing to do is make sure that, because we are also the training agency that is accrediting your training program if you're using us, you also should be acting within the standards you've been trained to, because remember, it has to be defensible in court. If you go to court and say, well, your training did this, you were never trained to do it this way, then why are you doing that? How defensible is that? Yeah. This is why our standards and the SOGs should never really be conflicting with each other, because if you're training to do it one way to stay within our standards, but then you're doing it a different way according to your SOGs, it's not going to be defensible later on. Mm-hmm. And with that, does that mean that our methods are perfect? No, they're up for review. That's why we have a review process. We learn we continue to change things. Now, do we keep them within the best practices for right now? Absolutely. We do believe that they are following the best practices right now. Could we possibly learn something based off a new study that would cause us to change it? Sure. Absolutely. And so we are constantly trying to keep a review. If any of our members out there actually have something that they would like to see changed or anything like that, they are more than welcome to go through the process of letting us know so we can actually review that too and take it under advisement based off of it. But that's why we keep it broad too, is so that we are not getting it so down to a certain point that it needs to be revised constantly in order to change this little thing or that little thing that basically is causing a team. Yeah, that's not helping a team out. We want these to be broad enough that they're defensible for you guys, that we can defend you guys, because here's the other part. If they are so minute in their detail, then it's going to be hard for you guys to, every one of you, maintain and do these standards based off of what you have available to you as well. Not every team has an Olympic-sized swimming pool that's 13 feet deep that they can drop a car in and train in it. So we can't do that and mandate that you guys do some sort of specific confined space training that would be, or excuse me, confined water environment training that would be outside of what most of you guys are able to do. Because we want to be able to defend you later on if for some reason you ever make it to that point where you have to do it. And in the ERDI world, in the public safety world, litigation is probably going to be more often than in some of the other ones. And I say that because, unfortunately, the government operates in a pretty litigious world these days.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's part of just the nature of the job as well. So
yes.
Okay, so if we had to narrow this down to a couple of different like high level topics that should be in our standard operating procedures, what would you highlight those as?
All right, so I would look at this in a couple of different viewpoints. And one, OSHA, not every state's an OSHA state. And let's go through that point real quick. It's, at least in the United States, that's where we're going to talk about OSHA. Internationally, you'll have your own safety offices, or maybe not, but you'll know the rules you have to follow by. ERDI is both NFPA compliant and OSHA compliant. Some states are not NFPA-based states, but that goes back to best practices too. Most of the states that are not NFPA-based still have a best practice code or guidelines that they operate off of that are pretty similar, and NFPA being the National Fire Protection Act. But then also OSHA. If you are non-OSHA state, then you have an OSHA office within your state. Like South Carolina is a non-OSHA state, but we have the South Carolina Department or Office of Safety and Health as well. So basically, with that, our rules are every bit as stringent as OSHA's here. Some of them a little bit more so. So OSHA is still pretty much applicable in every single state because of that. So with that being the case, there is a rule within OSHA that basically during an emergency situation that the regulations dictated by OSHA, they don't necessarily not exist, but they can be acted outside of in order to basically mitigate the emergency. Now, let's go into that one more step, because unfortunately I've heard this quite a bit. Just because you are an emergency response team does not mean that you don't have to operate within those guidelines. What this is for emergency responses, meaning that life or limb is still in peril at this point, and therefore you can take those extra regulatory steps that you need to take in order to try and save that life or limb. But once life or limb's no longer in peril, say we've switched over to recovery mode now, and there's no chance we're going to save this person, we're just trying to recover them for the family, you still have to go back into those regulations and operate within them. So with that, typically OSHA is going to look more towards, at least in my experience, they're going to look more towards the commercial diving regulations. They're
Mhm.
still not going to hold you 100% to those because we're not a commercial diving operation. But they are going to look to best practices. They're going to look to whether the equipment that you've got is rated for what you're doing. They're going to look to the training that you've received and whether or not you've been operating within them. And so that is going to dictate how we're going to react. And so when we build our SOGs, we need to build them based off of how we're going to react in an emergency situation, meaning that we're acting in that extra regulatory state outside of OSHA and NFPA's guidelines necessarily. I won't necessarily say the NFPA ones, but OSHA's guidelines. And then what causes the transition and how we transition. So we're going to go from that emergency rescue scenario to the recovery scenario. So you need to have an SOG governing both and the transition. You need to have SOGs that dictate your most common forms that we know we're going to go to. Vehicles in the water, that's a big one. Here's a perfect example. How do you necessarily respond to those? What level of hazard protection are you going to be wearing? In most of these cases, we're going to tell you, and as your training will see in your confined water operations for anybody that's been through it, we go off of the Navy contaminated water tables. So with that being the case, that's what I would point to you guys on as far as building your SOGs and looking to that, since that's also what we use. And with that being the case, you're recovering a body, you're going to need to be in the highest level of protection as possible because now you're dealing with a bloodborne type situation. So with that being the case, full encapsulation, highest protection level you can get. And you're building your SOGs based off of these particular things. So body recoveries, evidence recoveries, vehicle recoveries, emergency rescues, so forth. If you have a boat, whatever method of transportation you have. And then one that's frequently missed that I see in a lot of standards that aren't there is a standard written as to how you're going to operate until a chain of command can be set up. Basically, it's short, it's simple, but if you're allowing your chain of command to make the decisions on what SOGs are being followed and so forth, you really need to have something set up from the point of dispatch to the point of an on-scene or incident command being set up that basically covers that interim period. That way, when your divers are getting there, your tenders are getting there, if they need to operate, there's a guideline that's kind of protecting them already, and I see that left out a lot.
Okay. Cool. All right. Anything else you want to mention on creating your SOPs, SOGs, anything like that?
Yeah, and Mark, that's the point you just made. That's yeah, and I'll mention that in a second. That's kind of what I was trying to say earlier with the OSHA does not cover non-state plan states. So yes, the divers working, basically if there's an employer-employee relationship, OSHA is going to wind up covering them unless there's a state plan situation. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we're both saying here. You can correct me here in just a second. Hey Todd, good to see you too. So, but yeah, that's pretty much the point I was trying to make on that one.
Cool.
All right, so going back with that one. As far as building it goes, what I would tell you is if you don't already have one in place, look to other teams around you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, go to them, especially since a lot of these teams you're going to be operating with anyhow. You may even have memorandums of understanding with them. So it's good to already know what they are doing. And Raphael, I'll answer your question here in just a second. Actually, I can go ahead and answer it now. I'm not 100% sure, buddy. You may be able to look that one up, quick Google search. But yeah, I can't tell you how many states are non-OSHA or not. But with that being the case, what I'm telling you is look to the surrounding areas, seeing what they're doing already, is going to help out, especially with interoperations. Anyhow,
Work smarter, not harder.
bullseye.
Okay, cool. So should we move on to our responsibility versus their responsibility?
Sure. Yep.
Cool. So what's our responsibility?
All right. So, and I tried to write this down. Our responsibility is to create a defensible training program based on best practices and routinely evaluate those programs to make sure they're meeting what our members need.
Mhm.
So, which is why we have a program.
Do you want to answer?
Okay, yeah, no, I'm seeing Mark. Mark updated his, and he makes a great point in there. So yeah, agency training standards and team SOPs is what we have to operate off of, and you're absolutely right, Mark. That was why I was saying what I did about the commercial ones. That's why they're going to look. It'll look to them because there's nothing that really does govern us. So they'll look to them for best practices, but really, when it comes down to it, we're not going to be held to them. They're going to have to hold us to what our exactly what you said, our SOPs, our SOGs, and what our training was for the operations. Some of the stuff I've heard, and you guys have probably all, if you're professional rescuers, you have heard this before. Things change one retirement at a time, and that is very true. I have seen some really strange viewpoints on doing training, especially back in the days when teams were still being mostly run by a lot of guys that training didn't really exist for. They had their open water certifications, maybe their deep water certifications, and that was about it. And that's what they worked off of.
Oh, wow.
And from there, they didn't really put a huge emphasis on their training. Some of them did, but because of that, I think I've seen industry-wide less emphasis on training than there should be, and that creates an elevated danger level for everybody involved, especially our operators who are doing this. So, and Todd, I'll kind of answer yours in a little bit. Yes and no. Todd, we'll cover that in just a little bit, and maybe even better to just cover that with each other more than anything, because there are very, very differing opinions on that. But I want you to see that I do see what you're asking here.
Mhm.
All right. But that's going to be why we do what we do, and that's our responsibility to you guys, is to make sure that we are creating a program that we are constantly reviewing for you, and that you guys get what you need. That's the importance of why we're here, is to make sure that we are supporting you. So if you have anything that you need to see, we do have unique specialty abilities. So with that being the case, if you have something that you need reviewed and you need covered, send in a unique specialty. We don't have a specialty that necessarily reviews everything out there. So we do have a lot of unique specialties that exist out there. So if you guys have something that you need training on or you're looking for, send it in to us. Let us know, and we'll see what we can do to try and help you out there. But also, if you see something that you just say, hey, listen, the industry's changing, we can't stay within this, send that information to us as well. That's one of the things whenever I've now left law enforcement and left the public safety teams, that is kind of an issue for me, that I want to make sure I'm staying close to the team so I see what they need. It's unfortunate that I've been in the trainings, unfortunately, where people that have been out of it for a decade or two are still trying to teach people. And with that being the case, we're getting a lot of outdated information when they're teaching those courses. And unfortunately, a lot of students know that it's outdated and not useful. And that's the last thing we ever want, which is why you'll also see, if you ever look at our standards, part of being an ERDI instructor is that you're also part of an active team, so that we are dealing with that being, you're not having outdated information or outdated knowledge bases still continuing to teach. So yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I got a text from Lewis from Code 3, so he kind of
Okay.
distracted me. But did you go over your responsibility or their responsibility?
I have not yet, and we're going
Okay.
to in just a sec. I was trying to read Lewis's text real quick.
That's okay. Todd says that on their team, they require new divers
Right.
to obtain their dive master cert. Or master diver cert, sorry. That's cool, Todd.
Let's see here. They require new divers to obtain it. Yep. And that's probably not a bad thing at all, because one, it's emphasizing training.
Yeah.
And two, I mean, it's also pushing you guys, because part of the Master Diver program is to try and create a more rounded diver by getting them more specialized training.
Correct.
And guess what? As a Master Diver, if you want to get those ratings, guys, TDI, ERDI, SDI, and PFI ratings can all, well, some PFI ratings can count towards your Master Diver rating. And Gator Wrestling here in Orlando. Awesome.
Yes, Todd.
Hey,
Yes.
submit that for unique specialty. We'll look it over. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a defensible one in court, though.
Oh, never
So-
say never. All right, let's get to their responsibility, and then maybe we can answer any last minute questions, and we'll go from there.
All right.
Cool.
So, as far as responsibility as members and divers that are operating under ERDI's training, what we ask of you is that, one, you come to us if you have any issues and that you need any assistance. So basically, just like I said before, if you need any other types of training that you don't know whether we have or not, come to us. We are more than happy to look at it, and we want to be here for you guys. Otherwise, why do we exist?
Exactly.
We want to know what you need and be able to provide that for you. So come to us on it. The other part is make sure that when you're building your guidelines, if you're going to be using our training as your basis, keep your guidelines within the standards. Remember, we wrote them broad so that they're defensible for you. So that's the big thing. Don't have anything that contradicts. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to defend you later on.
Yeah.
For any contradictory thing outside of our standards. But we're going to be there for you. That's our big thing. And Brian Carney, our president of the company, even put out an open letter several years ago to the industry to make sure you guys knew we are going to stand behind you as long as you give us what we need to stand behind you.
Cool. Any other? Lewis says very true.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else you want to touch on or cover? Last call for questions, if anyone has any. I think this is going to be a really good blog post as well. So
good. And that's the big thing. This is kind of it's not a hot topic item. This is kind of dry information to cover, but it's always good information to make sure people have. So big thing is, if there's anything I've said and you have any question on it, make sure, even if you got a comment later on, type it in there. We'll try and answer it the best we can. And just keep you up to date. But otherwise, we want to hear from you.
Yes.
Make sure you're telling us what your needs are so we can continue to give you what you need.
We work for you. All right, and with that, we will wrap up. We will be back here. I will be back here next week with Hannah Baker, our regional representative of our Cyprus and Greece office, to learn more about that region. So join me here on, let's see, I believe it's the 24th at 9 a.m. So until then, thank you again, Wes, and have a great day, everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Brittany. And thank you to everybody that tuned in, and thank you to all of our members.
Mark Phillips said contact